everybody, welcome to our third lesson from Unit 11. We're going to be talking about solving quadratic equations using something called the quadratic formula. So we can solve quadratic equations a number of ways. We first solved them by factoring. Next we solved them by taking the square root. Also, something that is useful is knowing what the quadratic formula is, because that is another way that we can solve quadratic equations that are in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. We do this by taking the values of a, b, and c and substituting them into the quadratic formula, which says x equals, so it gives us our x values or our roots. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, or divided by 2a. So the steps when using the quadratic formula, first is to use algebra to get 0 on one side of the equation. Secondly, it's to substitute the values of a, b, and c into the quadratic formula, and then it's going to be to simplify using order of operations. So the first quadratic equation we're going to solve is 2x squared plus 3x minus 5 equals 0. So the first step, use algebra to get 0 on one side of the equation. We already have 0 on one side of the equation, so we don't have to do any work for step 1. Second step says substitute the values of a, b, and c into the quadratic formula. So we need to figure out what a, b, and c are. A is the number in front of the x squared. So in this problem, a is 2. B is the number in front of the x, so that's 3. And then C is the constant at the end. The constant on the end is going to be negative 5. We always want to make sure we include the signs, whether it's positive or negative. I like to start each problem by writing down the quadratic formula. I know it's right up above, but I like to start that in every problem. And then from there, I fill in all the B's, the A's, the C's with the numbers I listed over here. So we don't have any number for x, that's what we're solving for. So x equals, it says negative b. So I'm going to take 3, but I'm going to put a negative in front of it. So b is 3, but in the formula it says put a negative in front. So negative 3 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 3 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 5. I'm just using parentheses to show the multiplication, all over 2 times whatever a is, and that's 2. So 2 times 2 in the bottom. And then for the next step, I'm just going to start to simplify. So I can multiply 3 by a negative, so that's going to give me just negative 3. So I'm going to start to drop some of these parentheses. I'm going to continue to put the plus or the minus and the square root. And the first thing I'm going to simplify is 3 squared. I know 3 times 3 is 9. And then I'm going to simplify the first product here. You could simplify the whole product at once if you want to. I'm going to first, though, multiply negative 4 by 2. So negative 4 times 2 is going to give me negative 8. But then I'm going to have to multiply that by a negative 5. And then in the bottom, 2 times 2 is just going to give me 4. So I'm just taking some steps in order to start simplifying this down to single numbers. So I have a little bit more simplification to do here. So I still have this -3 plus or minus, but I have some stuff under the square root that I still have to simplify. So I have 9 minus 8 times -5. So I always want to do multiplication before subtraction. So I'm going to leave the 9 here and multiply -8 by -5, which would give me positive 40 all over 4. Now, under the radical, 9 plus 40 would give me 49, the square root of 49. So I have this radical now down to a single number. And I know that the square root of 49 is 7. So I'm going to change the square root of 49 to 7. But now I have -3 plus or minus 7 divided by 4. So what I have to do now is split this into 2 solutions to break up this plus and minus. So the top branch, I'm going to put plus. So I'm going to do -3 plus 7, all divided by 4. And if I do -3 plus 7, that's going to give me 4 divided by 4. 4 divided by 4, which I know would be simplified to 1, which is one of the answers. The other branch, though, would have to be the minus. So I'm going to do -3 minus 7 divided by 4. And if I do -3 minus 7, I get -11. Sorry, 10. -10 divided by 4. You could write this as a decimal if you want. You could leave it as a fraction. If you want to simplify the fraction, both of these numbers are even, so we could take out a factor of 2 and simplify that fraction, or you could change it to -2.5. Writing it as a decimal would also be okay. All right, so we're going to move on to the next one. And again, step 1 says use algebra to get 0 on one side of the equation. We already have 0 on one side of the equation, so we're going to proceed to filling in A, B, and C into the quadratic formula. Now, in front of the x squared, technically there is a 1 there. I know there's no number written, but we assume there's a 1. And then in front of the b is -6. But then on this side of the equation, I don't have anything added onto the x. So technically there is no c value. So if there's no c value, we're going to sub in 0 for c. And then again, how I like to start off the problems is just rewriting the quadratic, oops, that's a minus, rewriting the quadratic formula. So then I can just go ahead and sub it in. So the first thing I need to sub in is -b. So negative in front, and I'm subbing in b, which is -6, plus or minus b squared. So I'm going to have to square -6 minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A, which is 1. And I'm just going to start to simplify. So negative times a negative is going to give me a +6, plus or minus the square root of, well, -6 times -6, when I square it, I get +36. Now, let's try to maybe simplify this all in one step. If we multiply -4 by 1, we get -4. But then we have to multiply that by a 0. So technically, anything multiplied by a 0 is going to be 0. So technically, this would be 36 minus 0. And then that's all over 2 times 1, which is going to be 2. If I simplify under the radical, 36 minus 0 is just the square root of 36, which I know the square root of 36 is 6. Now's when I have to break up my answer into the positive and the negative. So up top, the first branch, I'm going to put the plus sign. And I'm going to simplify. So 6 plus 6 is 12. Divided by 2 is going to be a 6. So that's one answer. In the bottom branch, I'm going to do the minus. So I'm going to do 6 minus 6 divided by 2. Well, I know 6 minus 6 is 0. Divided by 2 is 0. So there are my two answers, 6 and 0. All right, the next problem says x squared minus 8x equals negative 16. I do not have 0 on one side of the equation, so I need to get 0 on one side of the equation. So I think the easiest way to do that is to bring the negative 16 to the left-hand side of the equation. So I'm going to move the negative 16 by adding the 16 to both sides. So that's going to give me x squared minus 8x plus 16, because 16 isn't like terms with anything over here. So all I can do is write them next door to each other. And then that would be equal to 0. So I do now have 0 on one side. Next, we're going to fill in a, b, and c into the quadratic formula. So a is 1, b is negative 8, c is positive 16. Again, I'm just going to start by writing the quadratic formula down so that it's easy to see where we're filling in. So the first thing is negative b, which is negative 8, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 8 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 16, all over 2 times a, which is 1. So the first step is just kind of all that writing to fill in a, b, and c. And now we start to simplify. So a negative times a negative is going to give us a positive 8, plus or minus the square root of, the first thing we're going to do is simplify the negative 8 squared. So negative 8 times negative 8 is positive 64. Now, if we start to multiply, negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times 16 would be negative 64. All over 2 times 1, which is 2. So now if we start to simplify under the radical, 64 minus 64 is going to give me 0. And if I take the square root of 0, I get 0. So I'm going to break this into the two branches again. So up top, I'm going to do 8 plus 0 divided by 2, which would give me 8 over 2, which would give me 4. The bottom branch, I'm going to do minus. So 8 minus 0 would give me 8 divided by 2, which is also 4. So because I got two of the same answer, remember we call this a double root. All right, and then the last example for today says x squared plus 3x plus 2 equals 8x. Again, we do not have 0 on one side of the equation. The easiest way to get 0 on one side is to move the one term, this 8x, to the left. So in order to do that, I would have to subtract 8x from both sides. Now, I need to subtract 8x from 3x because those are like terms and I can combine them. So I'm still going to have x squared, but now I need to simplify. What is 3x minus 8x? 3 minus 8 would be negative 5x. And we still have a plus 2, and all that's going to be equal to 0. So our next step is to figure out what a, b, and c are. So that's going to be 1, negative 5, and 2. And then we're going to start to fill in those numbers into the quadratic formula. So the first thing is negative b. So negative times b, which is negative 5, plus or minus b squared, which is negative 5 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 2, all over 2 times a. And we're going to start to simplify. So a negative times a negative is going to be positive 5 plus or minus the square root of, and we have first negative 5 squared. So negative 5 times negative 5 would give me positive 25. Minus, if we multiply negative 4 by 1, we get negative 4. And if we multiply negative 4 by 2, we're going to get negative 8. All over 2 times 1, which is 2. Now I'm going to start to simplify. Under the radical, 25 minus 8 is going to give me 17. Now, 17 is not a perfect square. So off the top of my head, I have no idea what the square root of 17 is. So I'm going to have to pick up a calculator. When I pick up the calculator, though, I am going to start to do these two branches. If I type in the square root of 17 into my calculator, I get about 4.1, about. So the square root of 17 is about 4.1. So if I do 5 plus 4.1, I get 9.1. And when I divide that by 2, I get about 4.55. In the second branch, I already figured out what the square root of 17 was. It's about 4.1. If I do 5 minus 4.1, I get 0.9. And if I divide that by 2, I get about 0.45. So those would be my two answers for problem number 4.